Stories don't define you. How you tell them will.
Hi, I'm Sarah Elkins, your host and Chief Storymaker at Elkins Consulting. In my work with coaching clients, I guide people to improve their communication using storytelling as the foundation of our work together. What I've realized over years of coaching and podcasting is that the majority of people don't realize the impact of the stories they share on their internal messages and on the people they're sharing them with. What really lights me up is guiding executives in uncovering the stories in their lives that are meaningful. The stories that, when shared with the right audience in the right way, connect, inspire, and motivate. Here's what a former client had to say about our work together. As a leader of leaders, I struggle with how and when to use my stories to emphasize the points my audience is looking for. It's a delicate balance between sounding like I'm bragging and delivering a message that needs to be heard. Sarah's approach to storytelling clears that obstacle so that you can deliver a clear and concise message using your stories to emphasize your points. It's truly amazing when it all comes together. Greg McDonough, Blackburn Capital Advisors, and President of the Entrepreneurs Organization of Washington, D.C. Visit elkinsconsulting.com to learn more about working with me. Today, I'd love to highlight a guest who really focuses a lot of her attention on inclusion in the workplace, and that is something that obviously is on the minds of many of us these days here in 2021. So Alissa Carpenter is joining me today via another fabulous introduction from Meg Nossero out in Miami, Florida. And Meg is kind of the super connector, it seems, because she's introduced me to a couple of fabulous podcast guests in the past few months. So thanks to Meg. Alissa, thanks for joining me.
Thanks so much for having me.
I always start out with a very basic question because I love for our listeners to get to know a little bit about you from a different perspective than what they would find on your LinkedIn profile. So can you tell us a little bit about something that maybe most people don't know about you?
Yeah, I'm trying to think of something juicy or fun, but so for my work, I do a lot of training and speaking. Not at this moment physically around a lot of people, but I love being in that environment. But I'm actually really afraid and nervous during networking events, but I don't know anybody in the room. So going to an event where I'm not speaking, don't know anybody, it's not my safe place. As long as I know one person, I'm okay, but I feel very out of my element, stressed out a little bit before. Who am I going to meet? Where am I going to see people? So that really makes me uncomfortable. And I think people are really shocked to hear that because I do so many speaking engagements in front of really large audiences.
Oh, that's so funny. I love hearing that. And it does seem a little contradictory, but to somebody like me, that doesn't surprise me at all because I have kind of a similar outlook, except that I tell people I really don't like to go to other people's parties. Mm-hmm. I love to host. And if I'm invited to help cook or help make cocktails or help host a party at somebody else's house, I love that. And here's my theory, and maybe this is going to resonate with you. I realize that it's because I like to have a job to do. Mm-hmm. If it's my family and we're gathering together, I like to be able to walk away from a conversation and say, "Oh, sorry, got to go check on the steak," or whatever.
Yeah. I remember even when I was nursing my daughter, it's, "Oh, I'm sorry, I have to go and do this, or I have to wash the dishes," or it gives you this kind of safe out, if you will. Like, you have a great time, you're having the conversation, but you can step away and talk to somebody else and then come back. You're not going to run out of things to talk about at that point.
Exactly. Yes, it's so nice to have company in that. Thanks for sharing that. Just for our listeners also, could you tell us just a little bit? Actually, let's start with a story. Can you tell us a story about something that happened recently when you were doing one of these events that really made you light up, where you saw a light bulb come on in someone else's eyes or something like that?
Yeah, it's funny. I was talking to somebody the other day about how I miss in-person events. And it was something that I just took, quite frankly, just for granted. This is something that I do. You see people and you don't get those light bulb moments as much, I think, during a virtual session when you're talking with people, whether it's in a small group or doing a large speaking engagement. But just recently, I wasn't sure if I connected as well with the audience. There was a technical glitch in the program and some of the slides wouldn't work on their end. And I was so worried about it. But kind of, staying focused, staying cool, and the audience just continuing to engage so well. And the amount of email responses of, I actually really liked that the slides weren't there at the time because we were able to engage. It was more of a conversation. So it was something that I thought maybe didn't go as well as planned. And to see, okay, I can roll with the punches. People can still get the information. I can still create the space virtually and it will work out and it will be okay. So to me, that was just this great aha moment for myself. And then to get the feedback from other people that it worked, it was successful, was just a great validation point.
Oh, yes. Isn't that just amazing when things go that way? So was there any one person that mentioned a particular aha moment for them, one of your clients or one of the participants?
In that particular session?
Mm-hmm.
I think it was just the aha. I didn't need the slides. I didn't realize how much I craved the interaction of community with other people without physically looking at something on the screen. You can still build that community in that space. What I talked about in that session was how to build virtual relationships. So it really weaved well of kind of optimizing that space. And a lot of the things I talk about too are not necessarily common sense when in terms of relationships and building relationships, but a lot of people were even saying, oh, I didn't realize I had to share that I care about you, or I care about your well-being and how you are, and asking those questions, or just those aha moments of moving from the assumption that they were thinking their employees understand where they are, that they're there for them, they can ask any questions, to the I have to reach out and provide that information and ask the questions to them.
Oh, yeah, I could totally see that. And I love that you were tested on your theories about how to connect like that. I mean, I really think most of the time we're gifted those scenarios. I know it feels different to do it online, obviously, but to be able to demonstrate exactly what you were trying to put across, that must have felt kind of magical. Like it was exactly what it needed to be.
Yeah. And it's interesting because, you hear people talk about all the time about being vulnerable and show up and be yourself. And I think you're talking about experiences that previously happened and when you were vulnerable, and people can't necessarily see it as much. But when you're in this space of, oh man, these slides don't work, what are we going to do? And, you're talking to people, it's like, this stuff happens, right? This is the reality and this is what's going on. How are you going to roll with it? How are you going to have those conversations? You're able to demonstrate those actions and not hide behind that vulnerability. Be there and share kind of where you're at. So it's definitely at the moment that moment that something happens and doesn't go right, you don't feel like you're gifted that moment, right? You don't feel like, you want to give yourself, people want to be vulnerable when they want to be vulnerable, just in general about things. And I think sometimes when you're kind of thrust into those positions, it's when you can show up the most, when you can be your true self the most, and when people can really appreciate who you are and what you bring to the table the most.
Definitely. I think that's such an important concept that many people miss, is that opportunity. One of my dear friends, Kimberly Davis, talks about it. Her book is called Brave Leadership. And she talks a lot about owning that moment and not trying to hide it or make it something else. And she tells a story about crying as she was she was facilitating a session on Brave Leadership, and something happened and she cried, and she was so embarrassed. She walked away from that. This is in her book. She walked away from that going, oh my gosh, how brave was that? That wasn't very brave. And then the people that were in that session came up to her and they're like, thank you for showing that vulnerability. you really showed us that it's okay to do that. And I felt really connected with you afterward. So it's not that she was overly emotional. It's not like she was sobbing and not able to speak or whatever. She just was choked up, and she allowed that moment, and it was not intentional. But now every time I think about that, as a matter of fact, just a few months ago, I did a keynote that was, of course, virtual. And I was telling a story about our firstborn when he was first born. And I got teary because I had just seen him. He's 22. He's like significantly taller than I am, super strong, big, broad shoulders, has a full beard, Alissa. I mean, my baby has a full beard, and I had just seen him. He had just walked into the house to get something to bring back to his apartment. And so I'm telling this story of him as an infant, and I teared up. I got a little, choked up. And it was Kimberly's story that popped into my head. I'm like, I can let this happen. It's actually important that I do let this happen.
Yeah, I think people need to see you as, right? And it's that, as silly as it sounds, it's this balance, right? You had it together. You were telling this beautiful emotional story. And I don't want to say you wouldn't be human if you didn't tear up or had some type of emotion, or it wouldn't be an important story if you didn't have a connection to it. So to show the audience and people that this is meaningful to me, and this is something that's, that's so important, I think it builds that connection, it builds that trust, it builds those relationships with other people.
Definitely. So speaking of our children, I know yours are too young to take the strengths assessment, but before I hit record, we were talking about StrengthsFinder, and particularly when responsibility is in their top strengths. Can you describe what that generally means so that our audience who are not familiar with StrengthsFinder will have a general idea of what we're talking about?
Sure. I can describe just briefly the assessment in general and what that means. Would that be helpful?
Sure. I'm sure it would be helpful for our listeners. They've heard me refer to StrengthsFinder a lot as a coach, but I think it would be really helpful for somebody else to use their words for it.
No, sure. I'll just give a brief description. It's one of Gallup's assessments where it helps you identify your top talents. In most of the reports, you can get your top 5 talents. There are 34 strengths over 4 themes: so relationship building, influencing, strategic thinking, and executing. So each one of those falls into those categories. And it was interesting when I got my report, when I got the whole 34, if you kind of go in and want to know everything, responsibility showed up in my top 10. And all of these things are strengths and all of these things are talents, but it's things that you wake up doing without even realizing that they're a talent. It's just something that you can do near perfection. And while responsibility is such an incredible strength, as we were talking before, I think it can be so tough, especially growing up and in your formative years, when you feel so much responsibility to yourself, to your family, to your community. And sometimes I even find it hard to balance of what is most important. I told somebody I would do this work, or I said that I would make this happen, and I can't not make this thing happen. It's just in me. If it's due Tuesday, I'm going to give it to you probably the week before. You're definitely going to get it. But I feel like that's really hard growing up, because you're also trying to manage whose responsibility is most important, maybe forgetting about yourself, maybe forgetting about somebody else. And I can imagine that internal struggle during that time.
Absolutely. And for our listeners, a person who has a natural talent that has responsibility in their top strengths, what that means is that this is the person that when they say they're going to do something, they're going to do something. But it's not just because they care about you or they care about whatever they're doing. It's because they identify as a responsible person. That is part of their identity. It's a core value. And so they put a lot of pressure on themselves. And I was just telling Alissa before I hit record that our younger son has responsibility in his top 5 strengths. It might even be his number 1 talent. And when I look back at his role in our family, that has definitely played out from the time he was 14, maybe 13. He took that on. And there are times where I've had these conversations with him about, well, is that your responsibility? Or does that belong to someone else? And he has, I think because we have those conversations, he's been able to find some way of adjusting his mindset about responsibility. But I was talking to a man who is probably in his 30s, one of my coaching clients, and he has responsibility in his top strengths. And he asked if these change over time. And I said, well, they can, but it's not usually a significant change. So you probably had responsibility when you were younger too. And he laughed out loud. He was like, oh my gosh, I was the most irresponsible young man between 16 and 25. Like I was so irresponsible. I said, really? Were you really irresponsible? He said, well, I bounced checks. I didn't stay in school. I dropped out, blah, blah, blah. But I asked him, how close are you to your friends and family? He said, well, I'm pretty close to my family, but my friends, I have this core group of friends. I said, okay, so when you were 18, 19, were you part of that core group? He said, yeah. And I said, my guess is that they called you when they were in trouble. My guess is that when they needed somebody to help them with something, to show up for a move or to bail them out or to pick them up as the designated driver, they knew they could count on you to do that. He said, well, yeah. And I said, that's how your responsibility showed up then. And it's different. It's showing up differently now that you have other roles in your life, like being a father and being a husband. Mm-hmm. So have you noticed that as well, that shift in how it shows up?
Yeah. And it's even the difference between, and you obviously know as a coach, just being that raw versus mature talent, right? And how much you work on it. And it's interesting. I've taken it a couple of times, just going through the training process for certification. And the top 12 are the same. They just might be in a different order based on your mindset at the moment, but they show up in different ways. And I think even just personally and professionally, or people put it in a box of these are my professional strengths. Like, no, this is who you are as a person, right? You might not show up as a responsible employee, but again, like your client of friends and family, you're really holding that, that responsibility. The relator is in my top talent. And when I was younger, it was still smaller groups, but a lot of smaller groups of people that I used to kind of be around, just given that state. And now it's just really a core group of people that I'm with versus the kind of the small group. So how I relate to people and who I hang out with has really shifted. Communication for me is shifted from a lot of oral communication to more written communication. So how I go about things and how I do it has shifted over time, but it's also where I am in my life. Before I had kids, having kids, and then having a business, priorities shift, and how I can tap into them has continued to shift. And I know will, based on what's happening.
Yeah, I love that you said that, because I have only ever taken it once, but I was employed full time. I wasn't self-employed when I took it yet. And I remember not being at all surprised by numbers 3, 4, 5, 6, but I was shocked at numbers 1 and 2. And as that I've worked with hundreds of clients, I see a lot of people are surprised by their numbers 1 and 2. Not everybody. I mean, plenty of people are like, oh yeah, that totally describes me. But what I find is that there are quite a few. It's pretty common to be surprised by the top 2 because they come so naturally. Mm-hmm. It just happens. And so the way that I describe it to my clients is these are the talents that people compliment you all the time, and you're really dismissive of them. Mm-hmm. So when somebody says, wow, I love the way that you just took this on and went from point A to point B so quickly, and you knew exactly what to do. I'm like, well, yeah, of course, because doesn't everybody do that? And so I'm kind of dismissive of that compliment. And so I tell my clients, that's one way to know. And another way is when you get annoyed when people do things a way that doesn't make sense to you because you have the fastest way or the most efficient or the most productive way to do something. And you're like, you're so smart. Why are you doing it that way? But that's because that's your natural intuitive talent. And that's why people don't always, why sometimes it surprises people when that shows up. Have you noticed that as well?
Yeah. And it's interesting too, because the likelihood of you having the top 5 in any order is 1 in 276,000, and the top 5 in the same order is 1 in 33 million. So it just goes to show how unique we are. And even though my husband and I actually had him take it, have 3 of the same. He's a CPA, he's in accounting. I really don't even like Excel or numbers. So how you go about, right, and how you use them and how they intertwine, I think is so unique. So not all includers are the same, or all communicator, people with communication or positivity are all the same. So I think it's just so fascinating to me. But I love what you said about you get annoyed about other people when they almost don't see, or like, it's obvious,
right.
With the includers, my number one, like, how do you not see the person who works on this project is not invited to this meeting? So nobody here knows. It's like, how did that not cross anybody's mind? And that's the only, the first thing I think of. So it's so fascinating to see how different it is. And I'll leave out other things because those aren't my strengths. But that one thing, I'm like, wait a minute, what's going on? Right.
Exactly. Isn't that funny? So how are you using this? Can you give a story or description of how you're using this tool when you're doing this inclusion work? I'm not surprised you have includer as your number given the kind of work that you do. And I really, really appreciate it. I don't have includer anywhere in my top, like it's way down somewhere in my high 20s. And I have command of my top strengths, which means that I always need an includer near me, or I'm going to step in it with somebody, almost guaranteed.
We're a good match. Command is like my 32nd or something.
Exactly. Well, I'm of I'm in the camp of you can't make a decision by committee. And, sometimes you just have to go and just make a decision, where I know that every time I've had an includer in my team, like when I was the president of the Women's Leadership Network here in town, I had an includer. I didn't know it at the time, but now I look back, I'm like, oh, that's why I was successful, was because I had an includer on my team that would say, hey, you need to copy everyone on this, send it to everyone. I'm like, oh, okay.
So those are the best relationships. And I think sometimes, even at work, like we're scared of that, of like, I need to work with you. Like, Alissa, yes, we should send it to everybody, but not everybody needs to be here. Like, let's be real and let's make a decision. Everybody, we don't need to go around the room, but that's what makes things happen. And that's what helps kind of, I don't want to say keeps mistakes at bay. I mean, we're always seeing it in the news of how did this product get launched, or why did they put that on social media? Who was in the room? And it's because people aren't having these types of conversations. And I use StrengthsFinder a lot, and not always necessarily in all of the DE&I stuff I do. But I think when you work with people, I mean, one, you have to be really self-aware and you have to know who you are. And I think the strengths assessment gives you that. And you can have that aha moment of, because you do things, like you wake up in the morning and you do it, you don't even realize it's a strength or a talent. And I work with so many women who are nervous about command, or why am I coming across as bossy? Or it's, these things, and they're all right. And they're incredible talent. No, I'm like, I don't want to say envy necessarily people with command, but I think it's amazing, to have that strength.
Oh no, I'll tell you another story later, but go ahead.
No, and I think it's incredible to find out who you are and what you bring to the table, so you can come with a sense of confidence and know, okay, this is what I'm really good at, and this is my strength and what I bring, but this is also what I'm lacking. And this is what I'm lacking as an individual. And these are the people I need to partner with, and doing the team talent map with teams and saying, okay, we have so many relationship builders here. We have a lot of people who are strategic thinkers, but we don't have any executors. So we love to talk, we love to plan, but we never get things done. So what are we missing, and what can we do? And that even goes with in the inclusion space we're talking about. Even influencing is the least of all just across the board, statistically, people fitting in that influencing. If you want to make things happen, you have to build those relationships, as I see it, and influence people, whether it's a product, to jump in and to kind of have those conversations. So to see where you are, I think is important, to see where your team is, and to see where you are as an organization, I think is a big game changer, to know what you have and what you're missing and how you can make up the difference moving forward.
Absolutely. Yeah. And just for our listeners, DEI stands for diversity, equity, and inclusion. So in case you have been seeing this all over the place and didn't quite know what it means, diversity, equity, and inclusion. That's the kind of work that Alissa is doing. So Alissa, can you share a story about an aha moment for a couple of your clients when they realized that they could ask each other, or where those strengths were like, oh, that's why this has been happening?
It was interesting. I was doing some intergenerational work with a client recently because in their team, they were really struggling. They've been with the organization for a long time, would consider themselves a baby boomer, and we're saying, I have so many problems with millennials. I have so many problems when Gen Zers who are coming in, we're not able to connect. I just don't see it. And what I did was the strengths as part of some of the training that we were doing, just to see, where is everyone? Because a lot of the times people have the same goals. So they had the same goals within the organization. They were just going about it a different way. And to see the manager have that aha moment of, that's why that person frustrates me. And that's why they're not handing things on time. Oh, that person, even for communication, needs it in an email, or they're seeing it 7 steps ahead and I'm 50 steps behind. This is what we need to do. And it was just this aha moment that regardless of kind of generations and where we are, we need to have these conversations. I need to know who I can rely on for what. And just seeing their self-confidence go up a lot in terms of what they can bring to the table and the steps that they're going to take next is really cool. Because I think if you're struggling, you're like, I just don't know what to do. Like, I think I'm a failure. I don't know what's going on with my team, or they're just crazy. I'm great, or what's happening, all these emotions, we're going through. So for them to leave with some tangible information and truly build more connection and have conversations with their team about who they are was just this very cool aha moment.
Oh, yeah. I think a lot about the intergenerational workplace that we have now, but it hasn't been top of my mind for probably a year because of all the other issues with diversity and inclusion. But diversity is across the board. It's not just ethnicity or gender or race or whatever. And so I love that you brought that forward, that intergenerational workplace, because I think oftentimes we, I'm one of the older ones now, but luckily I'm self-employed, so I don't have to worry about it. But I've seen a lot in my years of having bosses that were much older than I was, and they seem so stuck in their ways. And I know that I constantly challenged them, but it wasn't because I was younger. It was because that's my nature. It had nothing to do with my age. And I think sometimes they would dig in their heels because they were threatened by it rather than, and so it was a confidence issue. And I think it would have helped, now that I look back at my different work experiences, it would have helped for me to know who I was and why I think the way that I do, and for them to know and to know themselves. I think that's the key here more than anything else, is that self-reflection part of, I can tell you that the way my command shows up now is really different generally, unless I'm with my family, but generally my command shows up really differently now than it did 10 years ago. It was always there because I know my mom and sister called me bossy and controlling, which is ironic because I also have adaptability. So I'm always shifting gears. But there was a time, I remember my mom, a few years before her husband died, was saying something about how bossy and controlling I was. And I was like, but I don't really care how you do it. You just said you'd do it, so I expect you to do it. Right. So, and to her, that came across as bossy. What's ironic, though, is that a few years later, when her husband died, I showed up at the house to help a couple days after he had passed. And My sister had been there for a few days. My aunt, my mom's identical twin sister, had been there for a few days. And I showed up, I walked in the door, the dog immediately burrowed his head into my leg. And my mom came and collapsed onto me, weeping, and said, "Thank goodness you're here. Now I know everything will be okay." And I look back now, I'm like, that was my command.
Mm-hmm.
That's when she knew it was going to benefit her to have somebody who was bossy and controlling in the house. So when you said bossy command women, I totally live that. But it shows up differently now that I know that about myself, having had the assessment, having had some coaching around it. And is there something in your top strengths that you have had some coaching around that has shifted the way that you look at that particular talent?
I guess a few of them. I'm trying to think of a particular almost moment, but it was interesting because before starting my business, it never occurred to me to build a business around my strengths. Like, even though you're doing it anyway, it just never really occurred to me to be so focused on doing that. But the positivity one, I struggle with sometimes. So positivity is in my top 5. People will say, I'm bubbly, I'm energetic. Like, that's just who I am by nature and have always been. I needed coaching around it because sometimes I think people have this rely on you so much to be that positive person. And that anytime you're upset or sad or tired or something, it's what's wrong, what's going on. I'm like, I need some time. Like, I need some sleep. And people's normal positivity is my bad day, if that kind of makes sense, right? So then It's very hard to be the person who's always positive and people are feeding off that positivity. So when you aren't positive in that moment, that coaching around, like, what do I do? What do I say? How do I act? Because there's so many kind of questions around it. And, even being in this space and being home and kids, and there's so much going on, and I'm always looking for the positive way out of it, but being cautiously optimistic, but coaching just around what does that look like? I don't have my head in my clouds. I'm really a positive, realistic person, but I think sometimes it might come across as I think things don't exist. I think problems don't exist. And that's not the case at all. I am just trying to find a solution to it or work around or just have a different mindset about it. But I think it's something that I've always really struggled with underneath.
Oh, that's really interesting. It's especially interesting to me because I was working with a coaching client who's a high-powered attorney who has positivity in her top strengths. And she said during our training that people often underestimate her. And I started looking at all my coaching clients with positivity in their top strengths, and all of them have had that experience of being underestimated. And it comes from this idea that you're not realistic, or that you are seeing things through rose-colored glasses, or that you're fake. And it's so interesting to me as I look back at all the people I knew that likely had positivity in their top strengths at work. And I see that pattern across the board. And I have to admit, I was one of them that was like, oh, that can't be real. Right. And so now I think that's one of the most important parts of our work, you and I as strengths coaches, is to make sure that people know every training I give, regardless of if anyone has positivity in their top strengths, every training I give, I talk about positivity. Because it's so important that we acknowledge those cheerleaders and stop underestimating them. I mean, I can tell you this attorney, people underestimate her until they see her in the courtroom. And then, it's like the blinders come off. And then afterward, they're like, wow, I just didn't know you had that in you. So I'm assuming you've had that experience multiple times.
Yeah. And I think it's also interesting to have people come up to me in an event and say, I followed you on social media. I've watched your videos. You really are the same person in real life. And I'm thinking, of course, like, who else would I be? And it's this, well, maybe she's fake. Like, this really isn't this person online. And then seeing me in real life being that same person, I think was I don't know if it just doesn't happen often, but was just this shock. And I'm the type of person, if you feel like I'm not going to be able to do something, I will do it. Like, it's just to prove that I can, or to try to do it. So I think if it's not being mean. If I say something or do something, thinking about your client as the attorney, that, oh, I didn't know they had it in them. If I've done something like that, it's this moment, people have, oh, I didn't realize you can be real about an issue, or you can really get on a soapbox and be passionate about something, and not this smiling every 5 seconds type of thing. So it's
Right.
very fascinating to see the other side in terms of their reactions to who you are and have always been.
Right. Well, I think across the board, that is an interesting dilemma. As a matter of fact, I talk about that a lot, that importance of, so Mark Bowden did a TEDx in Toronto in 2013 called The Importance of Being Inauthentic. And it was really about using your body language, using your expressions to make sure you're connecting with people if you have something important to say. Because if your authentic self walks around frowning all the time, you're highly unlikely to listen to your brilliant idea, right? So that's his take on it. But I think about it in the other side of it as well, which is making sure that we are in alignment with our values. So regardless of what people think externally, as long as my behavior is in alignment with my values, which my behavior could be way out there. Like many people don't realize I sing with a rock band, and not just any rock band. It's a 60s style rock band and go-go boots and vintage mini dresses. But I step out on stage and it's still my authentic self, because my values are still on full display, as well as my go-go boots. So
it's a great combination.
Well, I think so. But it's fun. And I think it's really important for that your last comment to be heard, which is that when you're in alignment with yourself, whether you're online or in person, people can see that, and you're definitely demonstrating your natural talents. Interesting. Huh. So I would love to hear another story from you, since this is, your stories don't define you. When you were just kind of getting started with your business, I'd love to hear a moment that you realized that you were doing exactly what you were supposed to be doing. One of those, you walk away thoughtful, but also feeling like a rock star. Like, yes, that's right. Do you remember a moment like that early on?
Specific.
Or even before you started your business?
Yeah. Well, going through, before I started my business on the side while working full-time at a university. And then I left that position and did my business full-time. In the middle, I took a strategic business planning class. And I wanted to prepare myself for the business side, which is funny. I worked at a prestigious business school, but did not have this business background. And having your business, you are a content expert, but not necessarily how to run the business itself.
Right.
Right. And you're like, wait a minute.
I have an MBA. I still don't know how to run my business.
but those are two totally different things, right? You take some of the skill sets. But it was interesting throughout the class and doing the books and meeting with my clients. And I was nervous. It was a huge transition. And there wasn't one defining moment, I think, with specific clients, but it was going through the class and just this feeling of, I can do this. These numbers make sense for me in terms of having a successful business. My feedback from my clients is really, really working well, because I was so scared to take this leap and had taken so much precaution and so much thought behind it to make sure it was right for me, for my family. And, after completing the class, I'm like, I can do this. Like, this is something I'm meant to do. These are people I'm supposed to meet. But I wouldn't say it was one thing. It just kind of all came together in this aha moment at once that just really affirmed that I can do this.
Do you remember after you left that class, the first time you kind of started to use and apply something you had learned from it, where it kind of, the light bulb was flickering in there?
It was more of the business. It wasn't there was nothing specific, I'll be honest, with the Excel spreadsheets or anything like that gave me this super confidence, but almost that I could create this. I understand where the money's coming in, where it's going out, how I can price myself, how I can ask for more. What I thought might work in terms of individual coaching was hard to scale. So it was those little bits and pieces that helped me create more of a scalable business and a structure for myself that one, I didn't know I needed or even existed, and that I could create that platform in those programs.
That makes a lot of sense. Did you meet anyone during that time that you're still in touch with that had an influence on you?
Yes. So the professor of the class I'm still in contact with, I would consider them my mentor through the writing process. I wrote a book. It came out last year with a publishing company. Thank you. It's How to Listen and How to Be Heard, Inclusive Conversations at Work. And I think not the class itself, but the relationship we built post the course was really helpful, again, in giving me the confidence of, yeah, I can go out and write a book proposal. I can try to get picked up by an agent and get picked up by a publishing house. So that continued confidence builder, I think, has always been really, really helpful in my relationship with them.
Did you have any inkling of this when you first met him in class? Do you remember?
No, because it was a late night class. It was a bunch of people in the course. It wasn't built up to have that one-on-one relationship. But I think, again, being who I am, just wanting to get to know them and hear from their experiences and how do they do this. Yeah, it just gave me the confidence again to continue to build that one-on-one connection that I need and I crave.
Do you remember a conversation with him that was that you felt like you were building something, that this was something meaningful?
So I'm not this one thing was pivotal, like just in my life in general, right? This one experience, this one conversation, I don't think defines me or who I am. I think it's a collection of similar experiences that create that. So it wasn't one moment or conversation I had with them. It was that we've continued to build that relationship, that talking with him consistently and over a period of time, we were able to do that. The moment, if we were looking for a specific moment, would be even me going and asking him a question, right? Going up after class and asking a question, going up after class and asking for a conversation, to then build that relationship and keep that going over a period of time.
Well, I think that is an important part of the storytelling concept, is that I've said this many times, that I don't believe in a light bulb moment in terms of the light switch suddenly coming on, but I do believe it's on kind of a dimmer switch. And there are certain memories that become more vivid that can demonstrate that longer period of time. So when I think about the period of time between when my father got sick and then when he died, I have vivid memories that are little snippets of it. And if I want to describe to somebody or relate to somebody who's going through something similar, I'm not going to tell them the whole story. I'm not going to say, well, at this point he was dying, and at this point he was, I'm not going to, that's not a good description of how I can relate to a person. And so I pick out certain key elements of the stories that happened that will then demonstrate the overall period of time. So that's why I ask the questions in that way, is because sometimes it's like as soon as you said, getting up the courage, the confidence to walk up and ask him a question that first time, that's a story. Like I imagined you walking to the front of this lecture hall. I have no idea what it looks like, but I have it in my head already because I've been to plenty of lecture halls. But I imagine you walking toward him with all the other students kind of walking away, and maybe 2 or 3 students coming up to talk to him and ask him questions. And that's a moment that I could feel with you because I know how it feels. I can relate to that idea of building up the confidence and courage to go talk to somebody that A, I'm not sure wants to talk to me, or B, that I admire and respect. And so it feels kind of like that awe moment. Like, oh my gosh, I'm going to go talk to this person. Or even C, just being relatively shy, maybe shy is not the right word, but just, hesitant to go and introduce yourself to somebody, regardless of the circumstances. So whatever of those 3 situations it was, or scenarios it was, I'm imagining that courage that it took to walk up and ask a question and then to do it again, because it gets easier, right? to do it again and then actually have a conversation. And then I'm imagining you walking away from the second or third conversation feeling lighter, like you know something that you didn't know 15 minutes ago. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I mean, I completely see what you're saying. I mean, it goes back to what I was talking about at the very, very beginning of our conversation of not liking being in a situation where I don't know anybody, right? And it gets that courage of having to meet that one person and have those conversations. And, it's interesting because, again, I don't remember what we talked about at the time. I don't even physically remember going and speaking to him, but I think it's so important, like you're mentioning, to think about it as a dimmer switch of this one experience and this experience and this experience. And then this is what all kind of creates who you are. Because sometimes, when you ask people, not you personally, but, what is the one moment where you think did this, or tell me about a time when you use your strength specifically. People are like, what do you mean? What is a time that I use this? But it's getting that other person's perspective, right? Whether it's your coach or an employee or a supervisor, to be able, isn't it obvious you looked at the meeting request and realized that this person wasn't there, or, you thought about plans A, B, and C. It's an outside perspective, I think, that helps you find your story, find where you're using your strengths and where you're kind of bringing value in, which is cool.
Exactly right. I love that you just said that, because I think many times we have to ask somebody else to help us identify those, especially the moments. One of the things I encourage my clients to do when we're first starting to uncover where the strengths are showing up is I'll have them send just the description of their top 2 strengths to somebody who knows them well, not necessarily a family member, because that's a different kind of knowing. And even they're the same strengths, they're going to point out different times that these things showed up, and it might be too confusing at that first moment. So I'll have them send just the descriptions without the words, because words like relator or strategic may have different meanings in a person's head than what's written in the description through Gallup. So I'll have them send just those top 2 descriptions and then ask for a story where that showed up. So I actually did that with my sister because we've also collaborated with work together. So we have lots of history, many, many decades of history. But I sent it to her because she really knows me, probably more than just about anyone. So I sent her my strategic, which is my number 1 strength. And of course, Gallup also includes little bits and pieces from your other top 5. So anyone, this is for our listeners' sake, anyone who reads their first description, if your top 2 are strategic and say command, and mine are strategic and activator, those top paragraphs are going to look a little different. You're going to have different sentences inserted into them. So they are customized based on all of your answers, not just what your strategic looks like. So that said, strategic paragraph to my sister without the word strategic on it, and said, I'm just curious. I didn't want to give her an idea of how I felt about it. So I said, I'm just curious. Do you see this in me? And can you tell me a story about when this showed up? And meanwhile, in my head, I'm like, I'm not strategic. I have no idea why this showed up as my number 1 strength. I am impulsive. I do this, I do that. I'm not strategic. So then my sister called me because she was so excited. She didn't just text or email me back. She called me and she said, oh my gosh, this is totally you. What is this? Tell me where you got this. And then I told her about the strengths assessment and she said, oh my gosh. And I said, okay, I'm going to be honest with you. I can't see that. Where is it? And she said, really? You don't know this about yourself? Because I'm very self-reflective. And so she said, well, remember that time that you did blah, blah, blah. Said, and the time you told me blah, blah, blah. Like, yeah, I do remember that. Well, what about this time? And all of a sudden, like all these moments in time, as I said, moments in time come back into my memory. And I'm looking at them, as you said, with a different perspective, a different frame of why it happened the way that it happened. And all of a sudden I was like, oh, that is strategic. So I love that you said that you have to sometimes go outside of yourself to find those moments in time and those stories that represent the strengths that you hold.
And it's cool to hear it from someone else too, of because those probably weren't those moments that you would have even thought of. It would be like, oh, it's a Tuesday. I didn't bring, it's like, oh yeah, well, I did that. Or again, because the one or two were things you just do. And you're like, well, obviously I thought about this and this. Why didn't you? But to your sister, whomever you're talking to, it's this moment of, this is unique. This is different. This is special. And this is what makes you who you are. So it's really cool, I think, to hear from somebody else what makes you you and how it shows up in your relationship with them too.
Yes, I like to say it uncovers your magic. And there are days and months and years in our lives where it's really hard to see our magic, where things are just not right. We're not living in our strengths. We're not feeding them. And so it's really hard to see, and having that outside perspective can really contribute to bringing us back out of that darkness and start feeding those strengths again. So I'm curious about how you feed some of your strengths. Do you think about that at all?
Well, it's interesting that you said kind of this darkness, and not that it's a darkness, but I remember it was a couple of years ago thinking like how, going through and continuing to coach people of how am I using my strengths and how am I showing up in my relationships with friends? So I would text them, tell me just 5 things, like, why are we friends? Or what do you like about our friendship? Or how do I use my strengths? And my friends know that is a typical weird text that I would be the one, right, sending that text to them. And it was so fascinating just getting these responses back. And then we were helping each other. We were doing the same. And I've written them down and I'll look at them of, oh, I am. And I do the same with emails from clients of those thank you emails, or you helped me through this. And it's essentially a folder of all these moments that I'm using my strengths and I'm feeding those talents that way, because I think I forget, and sometimes we forget that these are, in fact, amazing. Our magic, our superpowers, are things that we're good at. And to see it written down from yourself and how you feel about it and how others feel about it is just great for me. In terms of education, I'm always, always, always learning and wanting to learn and grow, whether it's taking quick, like micro learning sessions or webinars or reading books or listening to podcasts. To me, that helps feed a lot of my inner strengths too. I need that information to keep going, to make.
What are your top 5? Do you have input or learner up there too?
I don't. That's in my top 10. And it was funny thinking I didn't love school growing up. Why would I be this learner? Why would I be, intellectual? But it's more of learning something that I love. It's right. So it's,
yeah. But I think that's generally the way that goes. If you don't,
but I think some people are school people. Some people just enjoy being in school and like the idea of learning to learn. I don't enjoy necessarily learning to learn. There are specific topics that I love and I crave, and I'll take a really deep dive into those topics.
So what are your top 5 or 6, just out of curiosity?
Yeah. Includer, communication, relator, positivity, and achiever.
Okay. That makes a lot of sense. The achiever keeps popping up, and I was curious about it. And that makes a lot of sense. Just for our listeners' sake, just so that you know, anyone can take the StrengthsFinder assessment. It is available on the Gallup.com website. You can take the top 5 or you can take the full 34. If you ever plan to work with a coach, I highly recommend you just go ahead and invest in the 34, because sometimes it's really helpful to see where you don't have talents, where they're really at the bottom of your list, partly because those are people that you often have intense friction with because they think so differently from you. And it's a great opportunity to start to understand where you could use some complementary talents in your life, and you surround yourself with people with those talents. So for instance, as I talked about at the very beginning of this conversation with Alissa, it was very helpful to me when I was the director or the president of a nonprofit here in town that I had somebody with includer in their top strengths, because that is not how I think. And I knew that my command was going to get in my way if I didn't have somebody that could look at my emails or my communication from that different perspective. So what would you add to that, Alissa?
I think everybody needs a coach, or to have a coach to look through it, because it's one of those assessments, or just in general, people are like, oh, I took that a while ago, or yeah, I think I took that. It's so important to have those conversations with somebody else about your results, to see them, to look at them, to evaluate them. And there's so much benefit, I think, as an individual, as in a team, as an organization, to be able to do that. And if you're going to do all the 34, I think that's awesome, but start and look at your 5. I think it can be so overwhelming when you're at first, people gravitate, I think, towards what's my 30, what don't I have that I feel like I should have?
Right.
Having a coach. But I think, working with you,
they always
coaches,
go to the bottom first.
Right. But working with other coaches, I think is so helpful to put that into perspective, because we can get lost in those 32, 33, 34 when it's not just about that. There's so much more to the context of it. So investing your time and energy and working with somebody through it, I think, is so important.
I totally agree. I know I took lots of assessments in my years as a college student and then as an employee of different agencies, and they were never very meaningful to me. I would look at them once and be like, oh yeah, that's me. And they were generally accurate, but I didn't go beyond that until I started working with a coach. And that's when I started to realize, yes, this is me. This is where I can really focus to spend more time. And this is where they're getting in my way when I'm not using them in a way that's helpful or productive. So the other thing that I loved about working with a coach was that it helped me identify where I was putting too much attention. I was feeding my adaptability too much, which meant that the other strengths weren't being used as well. And there's like this underlying dissatisfaction when we do that, when we feed one thing more than we feed the rest. It's like eating really good diet, but not moving around, not exercising. You're limiting the possibilities, the potential, when you're not looking at it from that holistic perspective.
No, I love that. And I think about it, sometimes my inclusion, I try to feed it so much with other people of, you're in a social situation, you see somebody in a corner, I want to make sure you're comfortable. I want to make sure you're okay. Or inviting people over or having discussions. And sometimes in responsibility, being in my top 12, I always forget a responsibility to myself too, right? Am I enjoying myself? Am I having a good time? What am I, you can put that aside. So having somebody really help me and have those conversations around what that looks like has always been really helpful.
Right. As you mentioned, prioritize. Who is my responsibility and how responsible is that?
Yes.
Yeah, exactly. And am I responsible to these people more than I'm responsible to myself? No, of course not.
Exactly.
So yeah, I love that. That is so important. I not enough people recognize that too. So I appreciate your saying it. So as we wrap up and come full circle, do you have anything else about your strengths or about your work with DEI that you could share with our listeners, and then kind of talk about where our listeners can find you and find your book?
Sure. You can find my book, How to Listen and How to Be Heard, Inclusive Conversations at Work, on Amazon, Barnes & Noble, wherever books are sold. And my website is notokaythat'sokay.coach.com. There's a lot of information about programming and speaking engagements. And I have an online program right now, which has been so much fun to create in a mastermind group around it, about being a diversity, equity, and inclusion change maker. So helping people really understand the foundational terms and what they can do when thinking about hiring or having those difficult conversations at work. DE&I, right? I mean, in general, it's such a tough space, right? It's such a tough space to be in, because growing up, we're told not to talk about these things, right? Not to talk about race, religion, politics, anything that could stir up some type of controversy at work. And now it's, let's talk about everything, right? Let's have these conversations, but be comfortable about it. It's fine. Just get yourself in these situations.
Right, get over it.
Right, exactly. And being in this inclusive communication space, there's this middle ground where you're not just going to be comfortable with being uncomfortable and saying and doing all these things. So it's important to recognize, I mean, I still make mistakes and will continually make mistakes. And as you're having conversations with people, whether it's about your strengths or anything happening in your organization, we're all trying to learn. We're all trying to grow. We're trying to make our spaces better for people to feel heard and feel valued and really understand one another. So yes, it's getting comfortable with being uncomfortable, but it's recognizing that it's going to feel weird. It's going to feel uncomfortable, and and finding those people that you have those connections with and building those stories. And I understanding your strengths of what am I doing well? Who do I need help with to make this better, better for everyone. But I think it's hard. I think it's a hard space to be in. And with everything, especially going on in our world and our society right now, it makes it a little bit more even difficult to get up the courage to start talking about a lot of the things that we need to.
Mm-hmm. I like to remind listeners that whatever side of this conversation you're on, whether you're learning or sharing, approaching it with curiosity, really honestly being curious about another person's perspective is a great place to start. And also knowing that gentle correction is the way to go. So if your friend says something, kind of steps in it with you and it feels icky, if you don't say anything then you're simply not valuing that relationship. But you can gently correct. You can say, that's not really a phrase that we use anymore. And this is why it makes me a little uncomfortable. And yes, it is awkward. And I have to say, awkward isn't bad. Awkward doesn't have to be bad. It's just awkward. So,
and it's interesting because we learn these skills and experiences in other places, but in the D&I space, it's so hard for people to realize it's the same thing. Just,
right.
we don't have to tiptoe it around like we think we do, right? Tell me more, help me understand. I didn't used to think that way. That's so interesting, right? Use those phrases and those terms. I think it's great to learn from other sides. I specifically put myself in situations where I'm learning different perspectives to gain more information. And that's hard. I think that's hard for people to understand you can't always hang around people like you. You'll keep hiring people that look like you, who experience things similarly to you, find people with different strengths and experiences and cultures and races and religions. And it's just really helpful as an individual to grow, and especially in your organization as well.
Mm-hmm. Definitely. So for our listeners, I will have links to her book, to Alissa's book, as well as her website. And are you on LinkedIn?
I am. Yep. Great. Under Alissa Carpenter. Mm-hmm.
Great. So I'll also add a link to Alissa's LinkedIn profile so you can follow her or potentially connect with her if you'd like to learn more about her. Alissa, thank you so much for joining me on Your Stories Don't Define You. How You Tell Them Will. I really appreciate your time and energy today.
Thank you, Sarah.
Are you ready to start your story portfolio so you have the right story ready to share when the opportunity presents itself? When you're ready to get started, my book, Your Stories Don't Define You, How You Tell Them Will, is available in all the regular places, and the audiobook version is available on Google Play and on my website, elkinsconsulting.com. As a special bonus for listeners, the audiobook includes 2 songs recorded by my band, Spare Change, in my living room in Montana. Also on my website is a free podcast interview checklist. It's available to download to make sure you make the most out of your next podcast interview. If you enjoyed this podcast, please feel free to rate the podcast and leave a review. And let me know that you've done it so I can thank you properly. Thank you.